JD Vance is openly auditioning to be Trump's VP. Kristi Noem threw a bit of a wrench in the situation when she admitted to killing a puppy and bragging about it. I don't know how that's going to win over suburban women that Trump desperately needs. They love dogs more than they love most people. But putting that aside for a second, this is Vance going on CNN, and Caitlin Collins here asks her if he, as he's condemning basically the students who are protesting against genocide, if he universally condemns any demonstrators that engage in property damage. And she really corners him here.
But you can't police people for being anti-Israel or pro-Israel. You can police people for violating the law. And we have seen some of that with some of these protests.
Okay, so you agree that people who break in and vandalize a building should be prosecuted?
Exactly.
Okay, I'm just checking because you did help raise money for people who did so on January 6th, which was, impeding an official proceeding, breaking into a building that they weren't allowed to be in, and vandalizing the Capitol.
Well, Caitlin, I know that this is the obsession of the national media to talk about what happened 2 years ago, 3 years ago on January the 6th.
It's not an obsession. I'm just seeing if it's a double standard.
Let me answer the question, Caitlin. I mean, look, here's been my basic argument about January the 6th. If you beat up a cop, of course, you deserve to go to prison. If you violated the law, you should suffer the consequences. But there are people who protested on January the 6th who have had the complete weight of the Justice Department thrown at them. When at worst they're accused of misdemeanors. Now, again, there are people who are accused of worse offenses, and that's a problem. But you can't have Black Lives Matter protesters.
Wait, well, I mean, what is he talking about? So he says at worst they're being accused of misdemeanors, and then he goes on to say that some of them have more serious charges. Can we go back actually just 5 seconds? I want to hear that again.
The 6th, who have had the complete weight of the Justice Department thrown at them, when at worst they're accused of misdemeanors. Now, again, there are people who are accused of worse offenses.
Yes.
And that's a problem. But you can't have Black Lives Matter protesters who rioted and vandalized goes free when you have people who were actually peacefully protesting on January the 6th who have the book thrown at them. That's the double standard that I'm most worried about.
Yeah, I don't think there's an obsession.
Like this is the standard is it righteous or not? Because the fact of the matter about January 6th, if that election was stolen, yeah, I don't care about any of that damage. I don't care about none of it. But the truth is that Ashley Babbitt got killed because of a lie that the political team that this guy works for told because of an election. But like the truth is, like, if I don't care about any sort of property damage for. Like, I don't care about, it's lunchtime, people want to occupy this counter. I don't care about none of that stuff.
Well, it's about the nature of the protest, right? Which I think people are desperate not to talk about. Exactly. Collins does a good job there with JD Vance and calling out his hypocrisy. But really, the standard should be what Matt is saying, is that that was a mob of people who were conspiracy theorists and who had bought into a lie that the election was stolen. And then the Black Lives Matter protests and property damage from that, or any property damage from these pro-Palestine encampments, which, by the way, we've seen cops do more damage to the property at, say, Columbia University than any of the demonstrators did. But like the difference there is because that is in service of something righteous, to stop a genocide, to stop police brutality, versus to try to overturn the democratic results of an election. Yeah, I mean, we should do the Sagar one too, because this also gets into the violence, and then that point is like is very important, because the thing that they're saying about vandalism getting into the hall is entirely, that's not actually, that again, they're just looking for a license to crack skulls, because before that, their license was they're doing anti-Semitism, they're doing anti-Semitic chants. And then you see how the cops enter that place. It's not really concerned about the property. But yeah, this is Sagar and Crystal, and Crystal absolutely corners Sagar into the, the word nihilism gets thrown around. This is a clear demonstration about either nihilism or crypto-fascism, in my opinion, the way Sagar tries to discourage these students. Let's take this.
if you have a medium infraction, it should be met with a medium-sized, reasonable response. So the reasonable response at that time would have been to do what they did in the interim, which is meet with them and be like, okay, guys, like what's going on here? Hey, we have commencement in 2 weeks. You're all going home. If you don't clear out, you're going to get suspended. It's going to be a problem. And you don't want that. You've paid all this money. You know, we have all this going on. And I think, you know, we're talking about lowering tension. But they threw the cops in.
Why?
Was a huge mistake.
Go ahead.
That said, now, though, you know, by boxing people into a corner and also kind of both throwing the cops and then backing down, they've set very unclear expectations. And now we have property damage and a wholesale, you know, occupation of the hall. And unfortunately, I do think it's going to end in some tear gas or something. There's no other, what other options do they have? There's no other way to clear people out. If you're going to barricade yourself inside of the hall, like, what are you going to do? And especially if they start vandalizing, which they already did, you know, to get in there.
Well, you could just, you know, do what students want you to do, which is to divest. No, I mean,
that's a great point. We'll take that. But again, if they got in there perfectly safely and didn't harm a single little sliver of wood in that hall, Sagar would still be calling for them to tear gas them. What are you going to do? They're occupying the hall. What can you do? He does not actually give a fuck about the property damage. That is insincere talking point by a fascist.
It is, and it's also just shocking because when you're talking about how they pay all this money to go to the university, that's a part of why the students are so outraged. It's because their tuition dollars are going to furthering an ethnic cleansing and the genocide, and so their claims are extremely clear. They want the university, and by the way, credit to Brown for responding fairly immediately and being one of the first major universities to just basically say, we're going to take a vote on divestment right now. That was an alternative option, and then you wouldn't have to have any of the property damage that, you know, Sagar is so concerned about. You could have just listened to the kids.
What you do at this point, Sagar and Jetty, is you give in to populism. The students already voted. Almost 2/3 want this. Okay, and then the trustees. Is it trusteeism or is it populism? The trustees said, no, we can't do that. Actually, you can't do Jewish Voices for Peace or Students for Justice of Palestine. And this is where the populist ends up. So let's see, Crystal.
Free speech, folks.
Crystal box him a little bit more.
Well, you could just, you know, do what students want you to do, which is to divest. No, I mean, that's the other thing is that I know,
but that's not going to happen.
But why not? Oh, it's not. But why not? Because there was a vote at Columbia Barnard, and it was overwhelming in favor of divestment.
Yeah, but the students don't control the endowment.
Yeah, but like if you have faculty and students who are overwhelmingly like, just do this thing, then why not just do that thing? And then you won't have your hall occupied, and you won't have to send in the cops, et cetera. But, you know, I think bottom line is, like I said, these students have already been kicked out of school and arrested.
She saved him by not making him respond to that point, but go back a little bit, Bradley.
He looks nervous even trying to make this point.
Thing, then why not just do that thing? And then you won't have your hall occupied and you won't have to send in the cops, et cetera. But, you know, I think bottom line is, like I said, these students have already been kicked out of school and arrested. So they're not
some
afraid.
Have. We don't really know. But I also would say this. Don't throw your future away for this. I know some of these protesters. Please don't do this. Your parents spent a lot of money on
I disagree with that.
You want to get your ass expelled for like this? What are you going to do 20 years from now?
These are people who have agency and who feel like they're standing against a genocide. And I'm proud of them. I think it's incredible to watch.
20 years from now, you'll be a footnote to history. You're going to be in some idiot on YouTube.
You know who will be a footnote in history will be someone like Sagar, who's not
giving him too much credit.
I mean, he won't even be mentioned. And that's because his whole thing, his whole shtick that Matt alluded to earlier about populism and even about these conservative claims about free speech crumble when that free speech actually threatens power. And Zionism is deeply intertwined with like systems of white supremacy and power and capitalism and the way that we've conducted our foreign policy in the Middle East. And so now that is threatened, that's when right-wingers who talk about free speech and populism crumble, because they're not really interested in the will of the people. They're mostly interested in kind of making these aesthetic arguments and aligning themselves with a power structure and even regressing as well.
Now he goes into PBD mode. Think about your future and the deals you won't be able to make. It's pathetic.
Well, they've thought about that. They're putting their careers on the line in part because they think this is so important.
But it's also a completely wrong-headed, like, old school way of thinking that's no longer relevant. Like, first of all, this one's been trotted out. Like, your parents are paying for your tuition. Where do you think, like, the vast majority of these kids get this sort of distinction of right versus wrong and morality from? Like, I would wager to guess the vast majority of these students that are protesting are protesting because of what's been instilled in them from their parents. I would wager to guess that their parents are very proud of their kids for making a stand here. Not all, obviously, but a good amount, I'm sure. Second of all, like the idea that you're throwing away your future forever. Listen, I graduated from college, Jesus, almost 20 years ago now, something like that. No one asks where I went to school. No one gives a shit. No one fucking cares. Like, unless you're going into a very specific profession where you need to get like a license to do what you do, like a doctor or a lawyer, no one fucking cares where you went to school in the real world. It's just the truth. The truth.
Yeah.
There's a little bit more of this too.
Well,
if you want to go, Brandon.
Brandon,
first.
go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I mean, I think, Crystal hit the nail on the head towards the end there, at least like tangentially. So I guess didn't hit the nail on the head really, but this is about teaching kids. I think a lot of much is to do with like, protecting Israel, protecting the state of Israel and the endowment itself in that kind of relationship. But this is also about actually hammering the point that this kind of populism doesn't work to the youth, because we don't want institutions of power, which Columbia is, and it's not a woke one, it's just a normal neoliberal institution of power, do not want to sort of teach the lesson that protest, that direct action, that mass populism is actually a way to change things. And so a lot of this is about disabusing the youth of the knowledge that they are capable of changing things in a way that is outside of like the proper channels, whatever those happen to be, which usually just allow for whoever is in charge of those proper channels to ignore your voice. And so a lot of these crackdowns by police, we saw it during the BLM, they're about just preventing this notion that mass action works, even though history has proven otherwise. And that's why they're constantly having to revise history of civil rights movement to pretend like it went down a different way, because they don't want you to learn the lesson that like, well, no, sometimes voting doesn't work. You have to take to the streets. You have to, disrupt things in order to get your way. And it doesn't require a mass of people over 51% of the country voting for it. It just requires a dedicated minority of people who have had enough. And, we're just getting to that point in American history, or I guess American as a national project, where more and more people are going to be taking to the streets, and stamping that out and preventing it from actually having a meaningful, or at least appearing to have a meaningful impact on the way our governance works, is a primary goal in tamping out all of these protests.
Brandon, that's such a good point, because I do think that like there is an existential threat to a lot of people in power right now, where the fact that these young students basically are not just voting Democrat and thinking that their political education ends and begins on what they do at the ballot box in November, where there's an understanding that this is a continuous process of fighting against these kinds of powers, and that sometimes you have to take things with force via activism and via these kinds of actions. That is a threat. That is a real threat to the natural order of things. And so the fact that that's spreading like wildfire like this, I think genuinely is just as much of a terrifying prospect as is our kind of hopeful dismantling of the Israeli settler colonial project.
Absolutely, because it doesn't take as many people to disrupt society as it does to change things at the ballot box. And that's what they're concerned with, the youth finding out, that the Martin Luther King Jr. didn't exist in a vacuum of civil rights where like no violence ever happened and no force was ever used and no one was ever inconvenienced. He existed in an entire ecosystem where the potentiality for violence was omnipresent, especially racialized violence, not just towards Black people, but the idea that it might, be a huge conflagration in America. And that was enough to get change made. And so what they're trying to get people to not realize is that you don't have to wait till November to vote, vote out Orange Cheeto Man. You can take to the streets and you can stop traffic and you can prevent things from moving forward. And then you can demand that in order for things to move forward, that they change things. I mean, the Republican Party does it in Congress all the time. They hold up the debt ceiling every year now, now. And we don't send the police in to make them do their jobs.
And it's important just to note that there's implied critique that this stuff doesn't work. This has a tried and true history.
Oh, yeah.
Sagar Enjeti is a 32-year-old from a neoconservative think tank. He is a fraud on these matters. He doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about. Listen to this guy who in 1960 took a stand against apartheid for Liverpool University and then got recognized for it.
These are black and white pictures from March 1970 of Liverpool University's anti-apartheid student protests.
the main incident was an occupation of the Senate House. And the reason for that was, the presence of Lord Salisbury as the Chancellor of the University, extreme right-winger, and he devoted his political career to the prevention of...
Oh, pause it real quick. Look at that. Some vandalism, guys.
I'm really concerned.
Somebody put paint that says "Keep Salisbury Out" on it. Well, send in the fucking cops, right, Sagar?
First, he had investments in South Africa and refused to disclose the full details of those. So because of that, we made our protest.
So you staged a sit-in and it lasted for quite a while.
2 weeks. It lasted for 2 weeks, yeah. If I'm honest, I suppose we had the time of our lives, really, but not particularly comfortable. But there was a great camaraderie amongst the people there, about 300 of us, sleeping on floors and so on. But it was fantastic spirit there because we believed in what we were fighting for.
Pete is now being recognised as having been on the right side of history, with Liverpool University awarding him an honorary degree.
As compensation, I guess, for the degree which I didn't get. My final expulsion was just a few weeks before my final exams, so I would have got a degree of some sort. So 46 years later, I got an honorary degree, and I guess we finally made peace with the university.
Do you regret getting expelled?
I'm asked that question often. The only way I can answer is to say that if I were to be in some sort of groundhog scenario and live through those events 1,000 times over as a 22-year-old student in 1970, I'd always do exactly the same thing again. And I still believe in the things that we're fighting for.
Natalie Powell.
Awesome.
So, who are you going to believe?
Yeah. Well, if it took him 46 years to get his degree, man, and we all know he couldn't do anything for 46 years. He just wallowed away.
He paid the price. He paid the exact price that Sagar's warning these kids against, and he's saying, you know what? I would do it again. And that is righteous. And anybody suggesting any kind of other method is actually stripping people's lives of meaning. We wonder why people don't understand, like, oh, I'm lonely, I'm alienated from society, life doesn't have purpose. Because this is the purpose. These are the purposes. And when you have people saying, actually shut up and take a check, they're robbing you of life.
Well, yeah, and they hate people like this. They hate people who stand up in the moment and say things like this because it makes it harder and when they're revising history to pretend like they were doing this exact same thing. The more people who are out there in the streets protesting, the more people who are speaking up, the harder it is, like, once this dies down, hopefully as soon as possible, for the Nancy Pelosi's of the world, for the Richie Torreses of the world to be like, well, I was always against it, and I was doing the brave thing of working behind the scenes to change things, or like I put my name on a list somewhere. Like it's embarrassing.
Joe Biden's done that, claiming he was on the ground at protests when there's no proof whatsoever.
Of course.
He's ever.
Yeah, of course.
It's this imagined history that every liberal thinks that they are entitled to by voting blue every year, that you're entitled to claim the Civil Rights Act, you're entitled to claim like the Civil Rights Movement and the second wave and first wave feminism. You're entitled to those things as part of your political legacy, even when all of these people would have been against it, because like many of the political parties were. Many of the politicians, regardless of party back then, were against it. There were a few who stood up, but in hindsight, everyone gets to be for it as part of their just like legacy.
Well, to feel good about themselves, essentially, right? Like it's basically a bedtime story. But I also just want to point out that what Sagar said about how it's not going to work is literally contradicted by past history that he was fighting for as well. This activist from Liverpool. What's his name, by the way?
Oh, that's a good question.
We should probably give it just because what a king. But yeah, like the universities did begin to divest, and that was a big part of why apartheid fell, because these students, and it wasn't back then, it took years later, but Pete Cresswell, that's his name.
Yep, he's a socialist. I think he's actually on Twitter.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.